Long before the first dinosaur ever walked across the earth, before the sound of thunder shook ancient forests, and before the sky was ruled by winged giants, our planet was already alive with strange and powerful creatures. This was a world without birdsong, a world without flowers, a world where the land was silent in a way we can no longer imagine. The earth was younger then. The continents were still drifting, slowly reshaping the face of the planet. Vast oceans covered much of the surface, and the air itself felt heavier, thicker, richer with oxygen. The sun rose over unfamiliar landscapes, endless swamps, towering ferns, shallow seas, and volcanic plains that glowed faintly in the distance. No humans walked these lands. No cities stood on the horizon. No written history recorded what lived and died here. Yet life was already experimenting. In the oceans, strange armored fish cruised through warm, shallow waters. On land, giant insects ruled the air. Giant dragonflies with wings wider than a human's arms glided between trees. Millipedes longer than cars crawled across the forest floor. Scorpions the size of wolves hunted along muddy shores. This was a time when nature was learning what it could become. Forests were not made of trees as we know them today. Instead, they were filled with towering ferns, giant club mosses, and strange plants that rose like green pillars toward the sky. The ground was soft and damp, layered with thick moss and fallen leaves that would one day become coal deep beneath the earth. There were no dinosaurs yet, no roaring tyrants, no long-necked giants, but the foundations of their world were already being built. Over millions of years, life would rise, fall, and rise again. Entire species would dominate the planet, only to vanish without leaving a trace. The earth would freeze, burn, flood, and dry, reshaping itself again and again. What we call the Age of Dinosaurs was only one chapter. Before it, there was another world, a forgotten world, a world older than memory, a world that time itself almost erased. And this is where our journey begins. In the next part, we will travel back more than 500 million years to the very first complex life on Earth, when the oceans became the cradle of monsters yet to come. Long before forests covered the land, and before creatures walked on solid ground, the earth belonged almost entirely to the sea. The oceans were warm and shallow, stretching across vast continents that lay mostly beneath the waves. Sunlight filtered down through clear water, illuminating a world that was only just beginning to understand what life could become. For billions of years, life on Earth had been simple. Tiny cells drifted in the water, feeding, dividing, and slowly changing. But then, something extraordinary happened. Life began to experiment. Around 540 million years ago, during a period now called the Cambrian Explosion, the oceans suddenly filled with new and unfamiliar forms. Creatures developed shells, eyes, claws, fins, and armor. Bodies became more complex. Movement became faster. The first true predators appeared. The ocean turned into a living laboratory. Strange beings swam through the water like floating shields covered in plates of mineral armor. Worm-like creatures burrowed through the seafloor, leaving trails that can still be found in ancient rock today. Soft-bodied animals drifted like living ribbons through the currents. Some of these creatures had no modern descendants. Their shapes look alien even now, as if they belonged to another planet. Among them swam one of Earth's earliest great hunters, Anomaloteuthis. With large eyes, a circular mouth, and powerful grasping limbs, it ruled the ancient seas. In a world where most creatures were small and slow, it was fast, intelligent, and efficient. For the first time, life was no longer just surviving, it was competing. As predators evolved, so did their prey. Shells grew thicker, bodies became faster. Some learned to hide, others learned to fight. The ocean became a place of constant change, where every advantage mattered. And through it all, the planet itself continued to shift. Volcanoes reshaped the seafloor. Continents drifted slowly across the globe. Ice ages came and went, locking water into glaciers and then releasing it again into rising seas. Life adapted to each change. Over millions of years, fish evolved from simple swimmers into powerful armored giants. Some grew jaws strong enough to crush bone. Others developed fins that could push against the seafloor, the first steps toward life on land. The ocean was no longer just a cradle. It was a training ground. And soon, some creatures would dare to leave it behind. In the next part, we will follow the first pioneers onto dry land, into a world of empty continents, silent skies, and untouched forests waiting to be claimed. For hundreds of millions of years, the oceans had been the center of all life on Earth. Every creature that lived, hunted, and grew did so beneath the surface of the sea. The land beyond the shoreline remained silent and empty, shaped only by wind, rain, and fire. But slowly, almost invisibly, the world began to change. Along the edges of warm, shallow seas, where water met stone and mud, new forms of life gathered. These were not yet true land animals. They still depended on the ocean for survival. Yet something inside them was beginning to shift. Some fish developed stronger fins, able to push against the seafloor. Their bodies grew heavier, more muscular. Their lungs began to form from ancient air-filled sacs. They could breathe, for short moments, above the surface. And then, one day, life touched dry land for the first time. The first pioneers were small, slow-moving creatures that crawled from tidal pools onto wet sand and moss-covered rocks. Their skin was thin and sensitive, their bodies awkward and weak. But the land offered something the sea could not: space. Above them stretched vast, empty continents, untouched by any animal. No footprints marked the soil, no wings cut through the air, no voices echoed across the plains. The world was open. Over time, plants began to claim the land. Primitive mosses spread across riverbanks. Simple vascular plants rose toward the sky, forming the first green carpets across the continents. Rain fed them, sunlight strengthened them. Slowly, the land turned from stone into forest. Insects followed. The first land animals were not reptiles or mammals, but arthropods.
Giant millipedes crept through damp undergrowth. Ancient scorpions hunted along river edges. Enormous dragonflies, with wings wider than a human's arms, glided silently between towering plants. The air was thick with oxygen. Fires could spread easily. Storms reshaped forests in a single night. And in the shadows of these forests, the first amphibians emerged. They still returned to water to lay their eggs. Their skin needed moisture to survive, but they could walk, breathe, and hunt on land. They became the bridge between two worlds. The earth was no longer silent. Footprints appeared in the mud. Wings beat against the air. The forests whispered with movement. Life had claimed the continents. And yet, dinosaurs were still far in the future. The rulers of this world were different creatures, strange, powerful, and unfamiliar to modern eyes. In the next part, we will enter the age of giant insects and colossal amphibians, when forests grew taller than cities and the land belonged to creatures that no longer exist.
The age of giant insects and endless forests. The land had finally awakened. Where once only bare rock and shifting sands had existed, now vast forests stretched toward the horizon. Towering plants rose from swampy ground, their trunks thick and fibrous, their crowns forming a green ceiling that filtered the sunlight into soft golden beams. This was a world without flowers, a world without grass, a world shaped by ferns, mosses, and ancient trees unlike any we know today. The air itself was different. Rich with oxygen, it carried every sound farther. A single movement in the forest could echo through the undergrowth. The wind whispered through endless leaves. Rain fell in heavy sheets, feeding rivers that carved slow paths across the land. And within this living maze, giants walked. Not dinosaurs, not mammals, but insects. Dragonflies as large as modern birds glided between treetops, their wings catching the light as they hunted smaller prey. Giant millipedes, longer than a human body, crawled across the forest floor, feeding on fallen plants and decaying wood. Enormous scorpions stalked riverbanks, their armored bodies moving slowly through the mist. The forests were alive with motion. Every fallen leaf fed new growth. Every dead tree became shelter. Every pool of water became a nursery for new life. The land was warm and wet, shaped by constant rainfall and endless rivers that carried nutrients across the continents. Amphibians ruled the shadows. Some grew larger than crocodiles, with wide mouths and powerful jaws. They waited patiently in shallow water, hidden beneath floating plants, until smaller creatures passed too close. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, they struck. The night belonged to them. Without birds or mammals, the forests were quiet in a strange way. There was no singing, no chirping, no familiar calls. Instead, the sounds were deep and heavy, the splash of bodies entering water, the rustle of enormous insects in flight, the slow movement of giant creatures through mud and reeds. The continents were slowly drifting,
drawing together into vast supercontinents that reshaped climates and oceans. Swamps expanded across lowlands, forming enormous wetlands that stretched for thousands of kilometers. These forests would one day become coal. Layer by layer, fallen plants were buried beneath mud and water, pressed deep into the earth by time and pressure. The energy of ancient sunlight was being stored beneath the ground, waiting for a future world to uncover it. But that future was still far away. For now, the earth belonged to forests and insects, to amphibians and shadows, to rivers that never froze, and skies filled with slow-moving clouds. Dinosaurs had not yet arrived. But the world was preparing for them. In the next part, we will witness one of the greatest transformations in Earth's history, when life learned how to break free from water forever.
The swamps still stretched across the lowlands, and the forests of giant ferns still whispered beneath warm rain. But the world was changing again. The air was growing drier. The rivers no longer flooded as endlessly as before. The endless wetlands began to retreat. And in this slow transformation, a new kind of life quietly prepared to reshape the planet. For millions of years, amphibians had ruled the land. They lived close to water, returning again and again to rivers and pools to lay their eggs. Their skin needed constant moisture. Their bodies were bound to the rhythm of rain and flood. But now something new emerged. Creatures with skin that did not dry in the sun. Creatures whose eggs could survive far from water. Creatures built for a changing world. The first true reptiles had arrived. Their bodies were covered in protective scales that held in moisture. Their eggs were wrapped in strong shells, allowing their young to grow safely on dry land. They could wander far from rivers and swamps, crossing open plains and rocky valleys where no amphibian could survive. The continents were pulling together, forming vast supercontinents that reshaped winds and oceans. Seasons grew stronger, dry regions spread across the land, forests retreated, replaced by open plains and scattered woodlands, and reptiles thrived. They basked in the sun on warm rocks, absorbing heat into their cold-blooded bodies. They hunted along dry riverbeds and across wide valleys. Some grew fast and light, built for speed. Others became slow and heavy, armored against predators. The world no longer belonged to swamps alone. It belonged to land. Across the ancient continents, reptiles explored every corner of the planet. They climbed rocky hills, they crossed deserts, they hunted beneath open skies where insects no longer ruled the air. Life had broken its final tie to water. For the first time in Earth's history, animals could truly claim the continents. The forests still stood, the rivers still flowed, the giant insects still drifted through the humid air. But a new lineage was quietly rising, one that would soon give birth to the most famous creatures the world would ever know. Dinosaurs were not yet here, but their ancestors already walked beneath ancient suns. In the next part, we will witness the greatest catastrophe life has ever known, a moment when nearly all living things vanished and the planet itself almost fell silent forever. For millions of years, life had spread across the continents. Reptiles walked beneath wide open skies. Forests stretched across river valleys. Insects filled the air, and the oceans teemed with ancient fish and strange armored creatures. The world seemed stable, balanced, endless. But deep beneath the surface of the earth, forces were gathering. Far below the forests and rivers, enormous chambers of molten rock slowly shifted. Pressure built over thousands of years. The crust of the planet began to crack, and when it finally broke, the Earth released its fury. Across what is now Siberia, colossal volcanic eruptions tore open the land. Lava poured across the continents in rivers of fire. Ash rose into the sky and spread across the world. Poisonous gases filled the air. The sun dimmed behind thick clouds of smoke. The climate collapsed. Temperatures rose. Oceans grew warm and acidic. Forests withered and died. Rivers dried. Winds carried dust across empty plains. Rain became rare. The skies darkened. The oceans, once full of life, began to suffocate. Without oxygen, vast regions became dead zones where nothing could survive. Coral reefs vanished. Ancient fish disappeared. Entire ecosystems collapsed in silence. On land, animals searched for food that no longer existed. Plants that had grown for millions of years vanished in a few short centuries. The forests that once covered continents turned into dry, barren landscapes. This was the Great Dying. More than 90% of all life on Earth disappeared. Entire families of animals vanished forever. Creatures that had ruled the planet for tens of millions of years left no descendants. Their bones would one day be buried beneath layers of stone, waiting for a future world to uncover them. For a long time, the earth stood nearly empty. The rivers still flowed, the sun still rose, the wind still moved across the plains. But life was fragile now. The planet had been reset. Slowly, quietly, in hidden valleys and along distant shores, new creatures began to appear. They were small. They were cautious. They lived in the shadows of a world still recovering from disaster. From this silence, a new age would rise. And from the ashes of extinction, the path toward dinosaurs was finally opened. In the next part, we will witness the slow rebirth of life and the first appearance of creatures that would one day rule the earth. The world that remained after the Great Dying was quiet in a way it had never been before. The forests were thin and scattered, the rivers flowed through empty valleys, the oceans moved beneath a sky that no longer carried the shadows of ancient giants. Life was starting over. Across the broken continents, small survivors crept through the undergrowth. They lived in hidden places, along riverbanks and in sheltered valleys where the climate was softer and food was easier to find. These creatures were cautious. The world had become dangerous, unpredictable, and harsh. But slowly, the earth began to heal. Volcanoes grew silent. The sky cleared. Rain returned. New forests rose where old ones had burned. Over millions of years, the planet rebuilt itself, layer by layer, root by root, leaf by leaf. And in this recovering world, a new lineage quietly emerged. They were small at first, light-bodied, fast-moving. They walked upright on long legs and balanced their bodies with long tails. Their hands were built for grasping. Their eyes faced forward, giving them sharp depth perception. These were the first dinosaurs. They did not yet dominate the land. They shared their world with many other reptiles, large predators, armored herbivores, and strange sail-backed creatures that basked in the sun along riverbanks. But dinosaurs had one great advantage. They were efficient. Their bodies were built for movement. Their lungs delivered oxygen more effectively. Their bones were strong but light. They could run farther, hunt longer, and adapt faster than most of their competitors. As the climate continued to change, dinosaurs spread. They crossed wide plains and climbed forested hills. They hunted along river valleys and nested on open floodplains. Some remained small and quick, darting through undergrowth in search of insects and small prey. Others began to grow larger, feeding on the expanding forests that now covered the continents. The age of giants was beginning again. But this time, the rulers of the land were different. They were no longer amphibians hiding in swamps. They were no longer slow-moving reptiles bound to heat and shade. They were built for speed, built for endurance, built for a world that demanded strength. The earth was ready for its next chapter. The skies were clearing, the forests were growing, the rivers were full once more. And across this reborn world, dinosaurs were quietly claiming their future. In the next part, we will follow their rise to dominance when they became the most powerful animals the planet had ever seen.
When dinosaurs took over the planet, the continents were no longer quiet. Forests stretched across river valleys and hills. Wide plains opened beneath endless skies. Oceans warmed, carrying new currents that reshaped coastlines and filled the seas with life once more. The earth had recovered from its great wound, and in its renewed strength it welcomed new rulers. Dinosaurs were everywhere. They walked in herds across open, grassless plains, their footsteps leaving deep impressions in soft soil. They followed ancient river paths, returning each season to the same nesting grounds. They crossed mountain passes and wandered through vast forests where towering conifers and cycads formed green cathedrals beneath the sky. Some grew taller than houses, others longer than ships. Some became hunters of terrifying precision. The long-necked giants moved slowly and patiently, feeding on treetops and fern fields. Their massive bodies swayed like living towers as they crossed the land, reshaping the forests with every step. Where they walked, paths formed. Where they fed, clearings appeared. Predators followed. Powerful carnivores stalked the edges of herds, waiting for weakness. Their senses were sharp. Their movements were measured. They did not waste energy. They watched, followed, and struck only when success was certain. Above them, the skies were no longer empty. Great winged reptiles ruled the air, soaring on warm currents above coastlines and inland seas. They nested on cliffs and hunted fish from shallow waters, their shadows passing silently over ancient beaches. And beneath the waves, enormous marine reptiles ruled the oceans. They hunted in deep blue waters, gliding through coral seas and warm currents, filling the role once held by ancient fish and forgotten predators. The Earth had become a planet of giants. From pole to pole, dinosaurs adapted to every climate. Some lived in tropical heat, others thrived in cool, temperate forests. Some even followed seasonal migrations, traveling thousands of kilometers each year in search of food and water. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs shaped the world. They reshaped forests, they shaped rivers, they shaped entire ecosystems. The planet itself moved with them. Mountain ranges rose, seas opened and closed, continents drifted apart. Yet through every change, dinosaurs endured, adapting, evolving, diversifying into thousands of species. They were not monsters. They were part of the Earth. They were its heartbeat. They were its living breath. And for an age longer than humanity has ever known, they ruled a world that seemed eternal. But nothing on Earth lasts forever. High above the blue sky, far beyond the reach of even the greatest flying reptiles, something ancient was moving through the darkness of space. Something that had traveled for millions of years. Something that carried the power to end an age. In the next part, the sky will fall.
The day the sky fell. For more than 100 million years, the world belonged to dinosaurs. They walked beneath bright suns and through gentle rain. They followed rivers that carved slow paths through forests and plains. They lived through shifting climates, rising mountains, and opening seas. They endured storms, droughts, and cold seasons. The Earth seemed timeless. But far beyond the sky, beyond the blue curve of the horizon, something ancient was moving through the silence of space. A fragment of a broken world, a traveler older than mountains, a visitor that carried fire within stone. For millions of years it had drifted unnoticed, crossing the dark between planets. It felt no gravity. It knew no seasons. It followed a path written long before life ever reached the land. And now its journey was ending. On a quiet morning, under a sky as blue as any other, a brilliant light appeared above the ancient seas. At first it was only a spark, a small flame far beyond the clouds, but within seconds it grew brighter than the sun. The sky burned. The air ignited around the falling stone. A trail of fire tore across the heavens, stretching from horizon to horizon. The oceans reflected its glow. Forests shimmered beneath its passing light. Then came the impact. Where the ancient seas met the land, the sky struck the earth with the force of 1,000,000,000 storms. The ground shattered. The ocean floor split open. A wall of fire raced across the continents. Mountains collapsed. Forests vanished. The sea rose into the sky. The shock wave traveled around the world, shaking the planet like a struck bell.
Winds faster than any hurricane flattened forests in moments. Waves taller than cities crashed into coastlines and swept far inland. And then silence. Ash filled the air. Smoke covered the sun. The sky turned dark. For days, then weeks, then months, the earth lived in twilight. No warmth reached the forests. No light touched the oceans. Plants withered. Rivers ran cold. The food chain collapsed from its roots. The great herds faded away. The mighty predators vanished. The skies grew empty. The age of dinosaurs had ended. Not with a slow decline, not with gentle change, but in a single moment that reshaped the world. Yet life did not disappear. In hidden places, in burrows, beneath fallen trees, along sheltered riverbanks, small survivors waited. Tiny mammals, birds descended from feathered dinosaurs, reptiles that could endure cold and hunger. They lived in the ruins of a fallen world. And from that silence, a new story would begin. In the next part, we will follow the world that rose from the ashes, the earth we would one day inherit. The world we inherited. When the darkness finally lifted, the earth was no longer the same. The forests that once stretched across continents had turned to fields of ash. Rivers flowed through silent valleys. The great plains where herds once walked lay empty beneath pale skies. The world had been reshaped by fire, wind, and cold. But life had endured. In the quiet that followed the great impact, small creatures began to emerge from hiding. They moved cautiously across fallen branches and broken ground. They searched for seeds among the ruins of forests. They drank from rivers that still carried warmth from the deep earth. These survivors were small, quick, and adaptable. Tiny mammals crept through the undergrowth, living in the shadows of fallen giants. Birds, descendants of feathered dinosaurs, filled the skies that had once belonged to pterosaurs. Reptiles returned to warm stones beneath the sun. The planet was healing. Rain washed ash into rivers. Seeds sprouted in dark soil. Forests slowly returned, growing leaf by leaf across scarred landscapes. New ecosystems formed where old ones had vanished. And over millions of years, the world became gentle again. Oceans warmed. Coral reefs returned. Fish filled the seas. Insects reclaimed the air. The forests became green and thick once more, filled with the sound of movement and life. Mammals grew larger. Some climbed trees. Others ran across open plains. Some learned to dig, to swim, to hunt, to migrate. They filled the empty spaces left behind by dinosaurs. The earth was no longer ruled by giants. It belonged to the small, the fast, the clever. And in this quiet, growing world, a new lineage slowly emerged, one that would learn to shape stone, control fire, and ask questions about the past. One that would look at ancient bones and wonder. One that would search for meaning in layers of rock and time. One that would name the creatures that once ruled the planet. That lineage was us.
The world we walk upon today is built on the bones of forgotten ages. Beneath every forest, every mountain, every ocean floor lies the memory of worlds that came before. The age of insects, the age of amphibians, the age of reptiles, the age of dinosaurs, and now the age of humanity. But our world is only the latest chapter. The Earth has always been changing, and it always will. Long after us, new worlds will rise, just as they did before.
After the age of dinosaurs ended, the earth entered a long and gentle silence. The world no longer shook beneath the footsteps of giants. No towering shadows moved across the plains. No enormous wings darkened the skies. The land felt open, wide, and strangely empty. For millions of years, the planet rested. Forests grew without being trampled by massive herds. Rivers carved new paths through valleys left untouched by enormous bodies. Mountains slowly rose and eroded beneath changing skies. The earth breathed calmly again. In this quiet world, life reshaped itself. Small mammals emerged from the shelter of fallen trees and underground burrows. They moved cautiously at first, their eyes always searching for danger that no longer came. Their world was gentler, but still unpredictable. Storms crossed the continents, rivers flooded and retreated. Seasons shifted with the slow movement of the planet around the sun. The forests became their refuge. Among the branches, tiny creatures leapt from limb to limb. On the forest floor, others searched for roots and fallen fruit. Along riverbanks, some learned to swim, others learned to climb. Every new skill was a step forward. The oceans, too, returned to life. Coral reefs rebuilt themselves from fragments. Schools of fish filled warm waters. Whales and dolphins would one day rise from small land mammals that dared to return to the sea. The earth was reinventing itself. Continents continued their endless drift. Land bridges formed and vanished. New seas opened, old oceans closed. Ice crept slowly from the poles, reshaping coastlines and carving deep valleys. And through it all, life adapted. Generation after generation, animals changed with the world. Fur grew thicker in colder lands. Bodies grew leaner in open plains. Eyes grew sharper in deep forests. The world was preparing for something new. In hidden corners of Africa, beneath warm skies and among ancient trees, a small group of mammals stood upright for the first time. Their hands learned to grasp, their eyes learned to measure distance, their minds learned to remember. They were not yet human, but they were walking toward it. The silence left behind by the dinosaurs had made space for a new story to begin, a story that would one day shape the planet more than any creature before. In the next part, we will follow the slow rise of the first human ancestors and the long path from forest to fire.
When our ancestors first stood tall. Long after the world had forgotten the thunder of dinosaurs,
The forests of Africa swayed beneath warm winds and gentle rains. The land was alive with movement. Herds of grazing animals crossed open plains. Birds filled the sky with soft calls. Rivers shimmered beneath the sun. And among the trees, something new was learning to walk. Small primates leapt through branches, their fingers curling around bark and vines. Their eyes faced forward, judging distance and depth. Their minds were growing sharper, more curious, more aware of the world around them. For millions of years, these creatures lived safely in the canopy. The trees were their shelter, the leaves their roof, the branches their roads. But the earth was changing again. The climate slowly cooled. Forests began to thin. Vast grasslands spread where jungles once stood. Rivers shifted. Seasons grew longer and harsher. The trees were no longer endless. Some primates were forced to descend. They stepped cautiously onto open ground, standing upright to see above tall grasses. Their hands were freed from walking and began to carry food, stones, and tools. Their bodies adapted to long journeys beneath the sun. These were the first hominins. They walked across ancient plains, following rivers and migrating herds. They learned to recognize danger from far away. They learned to cooperate. They learned to remember where food could be found when the dry seasons came. The land was no longer just a place to survive. It became a home. Stone tools appeared beside riverbanks. Simple shelters formed beneath overhanging rocks. Fires flickered in the night, keeping predators at bay and warming cold bodies beneath open skies. The night was no longer silent. It glowed with embers. It echoed with quiet voices. It carried the scent of smoke. Our ancestors watched the stars and wondered. They listened to the wind through tall grass and learned its warnings. They followed animal tracks and learned their stories. They learned to read the land. The world was becoming familiar. Step by step, generation by generation, they walked farther from the trees and deeper into history. The long path from forest to fire had begun, and the earth, ancient and patient, watched as a new kind of creature slowly learned to shape its future. In the next part, we will follow these early humans into a world of ice and fire, when the planet itself would test their strength.
The Age of Ice and Endurance. The world was growing colder. Seasons stretched longer, and winters lingered where once warm rains had fallen. Ice began to creep down from the poles, slowly reshaping the face of the continents. Mountains gathered snow that never fully melted. Rivers froze for months at a time. Vast plains turned into wind-swept steppes beneath pale skies. The earth was entering an age of ice. Great glaciers meddlingly dvigались across the land, carving valleys and pushing forests southward. Seas fell as water became trapped in frozen walls of white. New land bridges rose from the ocean floor, connecting continents that had long been separated. And across this changing world, our ancestors walked. They followed migrating herds across frozen plains. They crossed wide rivers on sheets of ice. They built shelters from wood, stone, and bone. Fires burned at the center of their camps, glowing like small suns against the long darkness of winter. The cold tested everything. Food was scarce. Storms were unforgiving.
The land could kill the unprepared, but humans adapted. They wrapped themselves in animal skins. They shaped tools from stone and antler. They learned to hunt together, surrounding massive beasts that could feed entire clans. They memorized the paths of the seasons and the places where life returned when the ice retreated. Mammoths wandered across frozen grasslands, their long hair rippling in the wind. Giant bison crossed wide valleys in endless lines. Woolly rhinoceroses moved slowly through drifting snow, and humans followed. They painted stories on cave walls, preserving the memory of hunts and journeys. They carved figures from ivory and stone. They buried their dead with care, honoring lives that had passed beneath open skies. The world was harsh, but it was also beautiful. Northern lights danced across frozen horizons. Stars burned brighter in cold, clear air. Snow fell in silence across forests and plains, covering the land in silver. Humanity endured. They crossed mountains, they crossed deserts, they crossed frozen seas, and wherever they went, they carried fire, memory, and hope. The age of ice did not break them. It shaped them. In the next part, we will follow humanity into the moment when the world warmed once more, and when the seeds of civilization were quietly planted.
When the ice began to melt. For thousands of years, the world had been locked in ice. Glaciers covered mountains. Frozen winds swept across endless plains. Rivers lay silent beneath thick sheets of white. The sea stood lower than it ever had before, revealing lands that had never seen the sun. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the earth began to change again. The ice retreated. Seasons grew warmer. Snow melted into roaring rivers. Valleys filled with water that reflected new green growth along their banks. Forests crept northward. Grasslands returned to lands that had once been buried beneath frozen deserts. The world was awakening. Human groups followed the melting edge of the ice. They moved with the herds as animals returned to open plains and forest edges. They settled beside rivers that now flowed year-round. They gathered wild grains and fruits from landscapes that grew richer with every passing century. The cold had shaped them, but now warmth offered new possibilities. Camps became villages. Temporary shelters turned into permanent homes built from wood, stone, and earth. Fires burned not only for warmth, but for cooking, crafting, and gathering. People began to stay. Along the great rivers of the world, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus, small communities took root. They planted seeds in soft soil left behind by retreating floods. They watched as green shoots rose from the ground where none had grown before. They learned that the earth could be shaped. They built irrigation channels to guide water across fields. They stored grain for winter. They tamed animals that once roamed wild. Dogs guarded their camps. Goats and sheep followed them across hills and valleys. The rhythm of life changed. No longer only following the seasons, people now created their own cycles of planting and harvest. The land became a partner, not just a path. Stone tools grew finer. Pottery appeared beside hearths. Weaving turned fibers into cloth. Trade routes formed between distant settlements, carrying obsidian, shells, and stories across continents. The first seeds of civilization were planted. The ice had once ruled the world. Now humans were learning to shape it. In the next part, we will step into the earliest cities, where walls rose, streets formed, and history itself began to write its first lines. The first cities of Earth. The rivers flowed wide and slow beneath open skies. Each spring their waters rose, spilling across fertile plains and leaving behind dark, rich soil. In these lands, where flood met field and sun met earth, humanity began to build something the world had never seen before: cities. At first, they were small, a cluster of homes near a riverbank, a circle of fires glowing in the night, a place where paths crossed and people gathered. But over time, these settlements grew. Walls rose around them for protection, streets formed between houses, marketplaces filled with voices, colors, and movement. Temples rose toward the sky, built from stone and brick, honoring forces older than memory. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, cities like Uruk and spread across the plains. Their canals carried water from distant rivers. Their granaries stored food for dry seasons. Their towers rose above flat horizons like mountains made by human hands. In Egypt, villages along the Nile grew into powerful cities. The river became their lifeline, carrying boats filled with grain, stone, and travelers from distant lands. Each year its floods renewed the soil, feeding fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Along the Indus River, cities were laid out with straight streets and complex drainage systems. Homes were built from fired brick. Wells supplied fresh water. Trade connected them to distant worlds. In China, early settlements formed along the Yellow River, where floods shaped both danger and opportunity. Farmers learned to work with the land. Artisans shaped jade and bronze. Communities organized under rulers who claimed the mandate of heaven. Time was changing. People no longer wandered endlessly. They stayed, they built, they remembered. Writing appeared, marks pressed into clay, carved into bone, painted on stone. These symbols carried knowledge across generations. They told of harvests and kings, of gods and laws, of wars and peace. Time itself became something that could be recorded. Calendars tracked the movement of stars. Astronomers watched the sky from temple rooftops. Engineers shaped stone into bridges and walls. Artists painted stories onto walls that still stand today. Civilization had begun. The earth, once ruled by insects and dinosaurs, now belonged to builders and dreamers. From scattered camps beneath ancient stars, humanity had risen to shape rivers, carve mountains, and leave marks that would last for thousands of years. The forgotten world before time had passed. A new world had taken its place. And yet, beneath every city and every road, the bones of ancient worlds still sleep, waiting to remind us that history is deeper than memory, and the earth is older than all our stories. The rise and fall of the first empires. As cities grew into powerful centers of trade and culture, a new force began to shape the destiny of humanity: power. Rivers carried not only water and grain, but ambition. Roads connected distant lands. Armies marched beneath banners that bore the symbols of kings and gods. Walls rose higher, palaces spread wider. Thrones were carved from stone and gold. The first empires were born. In Mesopotamia, kings ruled from cities that glittered beneath desert suns. Their laws were carved into pillars of stone, standing in public squares for all to see. Their armies guarded borders that stretched farther each generation. Their merchants traveled across deserts and seas, carrying silk, spices, copper, and stories. In Egypt, pharaohs ruled as living gods. Their temples rose along the Nile like mountains shaped by human hands. Pyramids reached toward the sky, built as eternal homes for rulers who believed their souls would live forever among the stars. In China, dynasties rose along fertile river valleys. Bronze weapons gleamed in the sun. Chariots rolled across open plains. Walls were built across mountains and deserts to protect growing realms. Empires unified peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived by different customs. They built roads, aqueducts, and harbors. They mapped the stars. They measured the earth. They wrote histories to preserve their greatness. But every empire carried within it the seeds of its own end. Borders grew too wide to defend. Wealth gathered in the hands of the few. Provinces rebelled. Droughts and floods destroyed harvests. Enemies watched from beyond the frontier. Slowly, cracks appeared. Cities once filled with voices fell silent. Palaces crumbled. Roads faded into dust. The monuments of kings became homes for birds and vines. The earth reclaimed what humanity had built. Empires rose like waves, powerful and unstoppable, and then they fell back into the sea of time. Yet each empire left something behind: knowledge, language, art, memory. Their ruins still stand beneath modern skies. Their stories still echo in books and stone. Their shadows stretch across history like long evening light. The forgotten world before time had given way to a world of kingdoms and crowns. And still, the earth continued to turn. In the next part, we will follow humanity into the age of discovery, when ships crossed endless oceans and the world became one.
When humanity discovered the world. For thousands of years, the world had been divided by distance. Mountains rose like walls between lands. Deserts stretched beyond the horizon. Oceans separated continents with endless blue silence. Civilizations grew and fell without ever knowing of each other's existence. The earth was vast, and humanity was still learning how to cross it. But slowly, quietly, the age of discovery began. Along ancient coastlines, ships were built from wood and rope. Their sails caught the wind, their hulls learned to ride waves. Their crews learned to read the stars and follow the paths of the sun. The sea was no longer a barrier. It became a road. Across the Mediterranean,
Traders carried olive oil, wine, and grain between distant ports. Along the Silk Road, caravans crossed mountains and deserts, linking China with the lands of the West. In Africa, great river kingdoms rose and fell along the Niger and Nile. And beyond the known world, new horizons waited. Sailors pushed farther into open oceans, guided only by constellations and courage. They followed currents across endless waters. They trusted maps drawn from memory and rumor. They crossed storms that rose like mountains and calmed into glass-like seas. When they reached new lands, they found forests older than history, rivers wider than any they had known, peoples whose languages carried stories of worlds unseen. The earth was larger than anyone had imagined. Maps changed, borders moved. New cities rose along distant shores. Knowledge spread between continents carried by ships and caravans. Ideas traveled with people. New foods crossed oceans. Maize, potatoes, rice, spices, and sugar reshaped cultures and cuisines. Animals followed humans into new lands. Horses ran across plains where they had never lived before. Crops transformed valleys and hillsides. The world became connected. Yet with discovery came loss. Ancient cultures vanished beneath the weight of empires. Forests were cleared. Rivers were redirected. Lands that had remained untouched for millennia were reshaped in a single generation. Humanity now shaped the planet faster than any creature before. The Earth, once ruled by insects and dinosaurs, now felt the hands of builders, explorers, and conquerors across every continent. The forgotten world before time had fully given way to a new age, an age where the planet itself became a single shared home. In the next part, we will follow humanity into the age of machines, when fire, steam, and steel transformed the world forever. When the world began to move faster. For most of human history, the rhythm of life followed the pace of walking feet and flowing rivers. Cities grew slowly. News traveled at the speed of horses and sails. Generations lived much as their ancestors had before them. The world moved gently. But then something changed. Along riverbanks and coal-rich valleys, new fires were lit, not for warmth, not for cooking, but for power. Water wheels turned beside rushing streams. Steam rose from iron boilers. Gears and pistons began to move in steady, tireless rhythm. The age of machines had begun. Factories rose where fields once stood. Their chimneys reached into the sky, releasing dark plumes that drifted across towns and countryside. Inside, enormous engines hummed day and night, driving looms, presses, and hammers that worked faster than any human hand. Cities transformed. Railways cut across continents, binding distant regions together with steel. Trains carried people and goods across mountains and plains in days instead of months. Steamships crossed oceans on fixed schedules, shrinking the world with every journey. The night glowed. Gas lamps lit city streets. Electric lights soon followed, turning darkness into day. Factories ran without rest. Ports never slept.
The sound of industry filled the air, the hiss of steam, the clatter of wheels, the steady heartbeat of engines. Humanity had learned to command fire and metal. Rivers were dammed, mountains were tunneled, canals connected seas, bridges stretched across wide valleys. The earth itself was reshaped to serve the needs of a growing civilization. With speed came change. People left villages for crowded cities. New professions appeared. Old traditions faded. The pace of life quickened. Information traveled faster than ever before through telegraphs, newspapers, and radios. The world felt smaller. Yet, beneath the glow of progress, the planet carried new scars. Forests fell, mines dug deep into ancient rock, smoke darkened skies, rivers carried the waste of industry toward the sea. The earth, patient and ancient, felt the weight of a world moving faster than ever before. Humanity had entered a new age, an age of motion, an age of machines, an age where time itself seemed to accelerate. In the next part, we will follow the world into the modern era, when science, space, and global connection reshaped the destiny of our planet.
The planet in the age of humanity. The Earth had entered a new chapter. Across every continent, lights glowed where once only fire and moonlight had shone. Cities stretched outward in every direction, their streets forming bright networks visible from the sky. Roads crossed deserts and mountains. Ships traced invisible lines across the oceans. Airplanes carved paths through clouds. The planet had become a living web. Satellites circled above the atmosphere, watching the movement of storms and seasons. Signals crossed oceans in seconds. Voices traveled across continents without delay. Humanity had learned not only to move across the earth, but to connect it. Science revealed hidden worlds. Telescopes peered into deep space, uncovering galaxies older than the Earth itself. Microscopes opened doors into the invisible realm of cells and atoms. Doctors learned to heal injuries that once meant certain death. Engineers built bridges that spanned miles and towers that touched the clouds. The pace of life accelerated again. But the ancient rhythms of the planet remained. Rivers still followed paths carved by ice. Mountains still rose and eroded beneath shifting plates. Oceans still carried heat from the equator to the poles. Forests still breathed in sunlight and breathed out air. Humanity now shaped these systems. Cities replaced forests. Farms stretched across plains. Dams held back ancient rivers. Ships crossed seas that once belonged only to whales and storms. The atmosphere itself began to change, warmed by the fires of industry and the breath of billions. The earth responded. Glaciers retreated. Seas slowly rose. Storms grew stronger. The planet, ancient and resilient, adjusted once more to a changing world. Yet even in this age of technology, humanity still looks backward. We search for fossils beneath stone. We study ancient bones and forgotten cities. We read the stories written in ice and rock. We try to understand where we came from. Because beneath the glass towers and glowing screens, beneath the roads and machines,
Beneath the lights that turn night into day lies the memory of a world older than time, a world of oceans and fire, a world of forests and giants, a world of ice and endurance. The earth remembers, and in its memory, our story is only the latest chapter. In the next part, we will step back and look at the long journey as a whole, from the first living cells to the world we walk upon today.
The long journey of life on Earth. The Earth has been traveling through time for more than 4 billion years. Long before forests covered the land, before oceans filled with life, before even the first breath of air moved across its surface, the planet was already on its path. Molten rock cooled beneath distant stars. Continents formed and broke apart. Seas rose and vanished. Ice advanced and retreated. The world was never still. From the smallest spark of life in warm, ancient waters, a story began to unfold. Slowly, patiently, over distances of time so vast that they are difficult to imagine. Single cells became colonies. Colonies became creatures. Creatures learned to swim, to crawl, to walk, to fly. The oceans gave birth to hunters and giants. The land welcomed forests, insects and amphibians. Reptiles conquered dry plains. Dinosaurs ruled beneath ancient suns. Then came fire from the sky. The age of giants ended. The world fell silent, and from that silence, small creatures rose and filled the empty spaces. Mammals learned to run. Birds claimed the skies. Humans learned to walk upright beneath wide horizons. Fire warmed cold nights. Stone became tool and weapon. Words carried memory across generations. Civilizations rose along rivers. Cities shaped the land. Empires rose and fell like tides. The planet turned through ice ages and warm ages, through storms and droughts, through destruction and rebirth. And through it all, life endured. The earth remembers every step. It remembers the forests that became coal, the seas that became mountains, the bones that became stone. Beneath every city lies a lost world. Beneath every road sleeps an ancient ocean. Beneath every mountain rests a forgotten sky. We walk on layers of history. The ground beneath our feet holds the memory of creatures that lived before language, before thought, before time was counted. It carries the echo of wings that once ruled the air, of footsteps that shook the plains, of waves that covered continents. Our world is not new. It is a story written over billions of years, and we are only the latest chapter. One day, new worlds will rise above our own. New forests will grow where cities once stood. New creatures will walk beneath unfamiliar stars. The earth will continue its journey, as it always has. Because long after we are gone, the planet will remain, turning, changing, remembering. And somewhere in its deep layers of stone and silence, our story will rest beside those that came before.